They called her the nation's sweetheart. A trusted face. A familiar voice in millions of British homes. Her presence on the screen brought comfort and calm. But on a quiet morning in April 1999, that voice was silenced forever, in a way no one expected. No warning. No threats. Just a single, cold-blooded gunshot on her doorstep. And from that moment on, a mystery was born that still haunts the streets of London to this day. Who killed Jill Dando? And why? It's a question that has echoed for more than 2 decades through newspapers, documentaries, podcasts, and police files. A question that has baffled investigators, journalists, and the public alike. Because in this case, nothing makes sense. The timing was odd. The method was clinical. The motive, still unknown. And the suspect, well, there was one, but the story didn't end there. In fact, it barely began. Jill Dando wasn't just a TV presenter. She was a national figure. A household name. Her work on BBC shows like Crimewatch, Holiday, and the 6 o'clock news made her one of the most beloved public figures in the UK. Elegant, warm, and always composed, she represented the very best of British broadcasting. There was never a scandal. Never a controversy. Just professionalism and poise. So when she was found murdered outside her own home in broad daylight, the country reeled in shock. Jill Wendy Dando was born on November 9, 1961, in Weston-super-Mare, a seaside town in Somerset. She had a happy childhood, growing up with her older brother Nigel, who would later become a journalist himself. Jill was close to her family and had a strong sense of kindness and empathy from an early age. Her interest in journalism began while she was still young, and she went on to study at the South Glamorgan Institute of Higher Education in Cardiff, now known as Cardiff Metropolitan University. She began her career at a local newspaper, the Weston Mercury, before moving on to television. It didn't take long for her talent to be recognized. She joined the BBC in the 1980s and quickly rose through the ranks. By the 1990s, she was a familiar face on national television. Whether it was reporting hard news or presenting travel documentaries, Jill brought a unique charm to the screen. Her role on Crimewatch was perhaps the most ironic part of this whole story. On that show, she stood before the camera helping police solve violent crimes, reconstructing brutal incidents, appealing for witnesses, and urging the public to help catch killers. And then, one day, she became the victim of a violent crime herself. A crime that would remain unsolved, just like the cases she used to feature. The last few months of her life were busy and full of promise. She had recently become engaged to her partner, Alan Farthing, a consultant gynecologist who would later become the Queen's surgeon gynecologist. They were planning a wedding and looking forward to a future together. Life was good. Her career was thriving. Her personal life was filled with love. And then, it all stopped. On April 26, 1999, Jill left her fiancé's home in Chiswick and drove to her own house in Fulham. It was a spontaneous visit. She rarely stayed there anymore, as she was mostly living with Alan. That detail would later become important. She arrived at about 11:30 a.m., parked her car, walked up the steps to her front door, and that's when it happened. A single gunshot. Close range. Right to the head. A neighbor found her body about 14 minutes later. At first, it seemed like a freak accident. Who would shoot Jill Dando? She had no known enemies. No involvement in politics or crime. She wasn't working on an investigative piece that might have drawn danger. But this was no accident. It was an execution. Calm, precise, unrushed. The police arrived quickly, and the case was immediately treated as a high-profile murder. Forensic experts combed the scene. Neighbors were questioned. CCTV footage was reviewed. But from the very beginning, something was off. There was almost no evidence. No witnesses. No clear motive. Just a dead woman in a country full of questions. And then came the media storm. Newspapers plastered her photo across their front pages. The BBC was in mourning. Her colleagues were devastated. Alan Farthing was in shock. The public grieved as if they'd lost a member of the family. But the grief soon gave way to frustration, as the investigation dragged on with no answers. Who would kill Jill Dando? And why? Was it a jealous stalker? A jilted lover? A random act of violence? Or something darker? The theories began to spread like wildfire. The early days of the investigation into Jill Dando's murder were marked by confusion, pressure, and a rising sense of urgency. Scotland Yard assembled a major task force known as Operation Oxborough. Dozens of detectives were assigned to the case. It was one of the highest-profile investigations the Metropolitan Police had ever undertaken. And yet, despite all the resources thrown at it, progress was agonizingly slow. There were no signs of forced entry. No stolen belongings. No evidence of a struggle. Her handbag was untouched. Her car keys were still in her hand. The killer had waited for her, approached her, shot her, and disappeared. Just like that. The bullet used was a 9mm Parabellum, fired from a modified pistol. The shot was so precise it left only a tiny entry wound with almost no blood at the scene. The angle and position of the body suggested the killer had pushed the gun against her head to muffle the sound. Neighbors didn't hear anything that sounded like a gunshot. Only a strange cry, a thump, then silence. Investigators began sifting through her personal life. Was there a disgruntled ex? A secret enemy? A jealous colleague? But nothing fit. Her fiancé had a solid alibi. There was no evidence of anyone stalking her, although some fans had written obsessive letters in the past. Still, none appeared threatening. Her life, both public and private, was clean, normal, stable. And yet, someone had executed her in broad daylight on a residential street in London. Soon, the theories began to spiral. Some believed it was a professional hit, perhaps by a Serbian or Eastern European gang, in retaliation for NATO's bombing of Serbia. Jill had recently presented a Kosovo crisis appeal on the BBC, which had aired just days before her death. Could her face have become associated with Western propaganda? Others dismissed this idea as too far-fetched. There was no solid link. No threats. No surveillance. It felt more like a tabloid fantasy than a lead. Another theory was that Jill had been targeted because of her work on Crimewatch. Over the years, the show had featured countless dangerous criminals. Could one of them have come after her? Maybe someone she helped send to prison. But again, no strong suspect emerged. There were vague names, hints, rumors, nothing concrete. Weeks passed, then months. The pressure on the police mounted. The public wanted answers. So did the BBC. And quietly, the Met was beginning to feel the heat. Then, nearly a year later, in May 2000, police made an arrest. The man's name was Barry George. He lived just half a mile from Jill's home in Fulham. He was known in the area as an odd figure. Unemployed. Solitary. He had a history of strange behavior, stalking women, and impersonating celebrities or military officers. His record included convictions for indecent assault and attempted rape. He had even once been caught posing as a stuntman named Paul Gadd, claiming to be a member of the SAS. When police searched his flat, they found a photo of Jill torn from a magazine, a collection of guns and ammunition magazines, and most crucially, a single particle of gunshot residue inside the pocket of a coat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to charge him. The media jumped on the story. At last, a suspect. A name. A face. But not everyone was convinced. Barry George was no criminal mastermind. He was described by some as socially isolated and mentally challenged. He had epilepsy, low IQ, and a history of delusional behavior. Could such a man have executed a flawless killing without leaving behind a single trace? No fingerprints. No eyewitnesses. No DNA. No CCTV footage. And if he had stalked Jill, why was there no sign of it? No letters. No sightings. Nothing to suggest he'd ever followed her. Still, in 2001, Barry George stood trial for the murder of Jill Dando. The prosecution argued that he was obsessed with celebrity and had killed her to gain notoriety. The defense argued that he was incapable of such a calculated crime. The evidence was thin, and the motive was even thinner. But the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. It seemed like the case was closed. But it wasn't. Over the next few years, doubts began to grow. Investigative journalists, legal experts, and members of the public questioned the strength of the evidence. The particle of gunshot residue, it turned out, could have come from contamination. There was no proof he had ever met Jill. No proof he'd been near her house that day. No one had seen him there. And his behavior didn't fit the profile of a contract killer or even a competent assassin. In 2007, after 6 years behind bars, Barry George's conviction was overturned by the Court of Appeal. He was granted a retrial. In the second trial, the forensic evidence was ruled inadmissible. With little else to go on, the jury found him not guilty. And just like that, the case was open again. The police were back to square one. No suspect. No motive. No leads. Jill Dando's killer had vanished into the shadows once more.